Good day, everyone. This is Wade Fox. I'm the host for this session of Second Opinion. We've got a very interesting guest today. I think it'll be very informative for all of us. We have Miss Sheila Harrington, who is one of our state representatives. She's going to come in and tell us a little about how the State House works and so forth, and some of the issues that we're faced with in the last session, and of course the ones that are coming up. So I know that it's going to be quite an interesting educational system. Thank you for coming. I appreciate Sheila.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to kind of start off with you. We've had a discussion, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I actually have lived in the Groton area, in Groton actually, since 1991. My educational background is I have a bachelor's degree in social work from Providence College, and I have a Juris Doctor from New England School of Law, and I've been practicing law for approximately 30 years. In addition, I carry two hats as elected official. I'm actually the state representative for the 1st Middlesex District, which is Groton, Pepperell, Dunstable, Townsend, Ashby, Ayer, and half of Devens. And I am the Massachusetts Republican Party State Committee person for the 1st Middlesex Senate District, which is Groton, Pepperell, Dunstable, Westford, and Tingsboro.
Okay. Well, so how long have you been a state representative?
I was elected in 2010.
Okay.
So
Great.
I just am finishing up the third term.
Third term, so it's 2 years.
2-year terms, yeah, which
great.
I kind of think is a problem, but I can explain that a little later.
Okay. Well, it might be interesting to really start off for a lot of the viewers out there to tell us about what the basics of a state rep does in the House and so forth. We hear about the House, Beacon Hill, and so forth, but I think outside of just talking about the governor here, we don't really understand how the state rep system works. Can you give us a little background?
Sure. So there are 160 representatives in the State House, in the House of Representatives, and each one represents between 41,500 and 45,000, I believe, are the parameters of your districts. And within that, the majority party is the Democrat Party, and their leadership is headed up by the Speaker of the House. And the Republican Party is the minority party. And presently, I want to say we had, I think, 31 of the representatives were Republican this past term, 31 or 32. So the minority leader then is Brad Jones. And basically, when it comes to bills and legislation, you caucus before them with your own party generally to kind of get a view. You have researchers in both the majority party and the minority party that help you make decisions with regard to pending legislation that will be coming up for roll calls. But really the bulk of what you do is in the district. You do a lot in the district. You attend a lot of events. That's the best part of it. You get to be at all sorts of openings and awards and things like that, which is a lot of fun. Birthdays for 90-year-olds and things like that. So that's really the fun part. The real meat of the work, though, on Beacon Hill tends to be, at least in my situation, your committee work. So I am actually the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, on the Joint Committee on Judiciary, and I am the ranking member on the Joint Committee on Rules. So Rules is I guess you'd say, an easier committee. Most of the work on rules is done at the very beginning of each session. The Judiciary Committee, for instance, the legislature files their bills in January of the first year of each session. And there's approximately 5,000 bills are put into play at that point. And then there are assigned committees. I want to say there's 20-something committees. Of the 5,000, 1,000 of them go to the Joint Committee on Judiciary. So we tend to hear sort of a greater percentage of what I consider to be the important bills that will come before the legislature.
Okay.
And the ranking member, just so people understand, is the majority party members are always the chair and the vice chair. The ranking member is the highest minority party member in the committee.
Okay. Well, since you brought it up, there's a small number of Republicans. This is as I always say, one of the bluest of blue states. Mm-hmm. How does your leader, chairman, how do you organize your schedules? How do you organize your efforts in the House?
Okay.
And how does that relate to what they do in the Senate? And when you have a Republican governor, is there an interface with the governor on these things, or do you guys kind of realize that he's going to be there for a while, or she's going to be there for a while, and we're going to keep going? I mean, how do you organize what you want to do?
Well, certainly having the governor in your party is advantageous, and I would have to say this past session did feel differently because of that, I think. What I would say, though, is with regard to Governor Baker, this last session was actually kind of an unusual feel up there because he's very popular on both sides of the House. Both Democrats and Republicans seem to have a great deal of respect for him. And I know that he regularly meets with the Democratic leadership each week, actually. And so they have developed a rather strong rapport as well. So there were issues that were contentious, certainly, that may have gone along party lines. You very often see that during the budget season, especially with regard to, I know the Republicans were most disappointed this year in the budget that we were not able to get the reversion money back to the cities and towns, which we have been able to do in other sessions, which basically says if we exceed our benchmark by a certain amount, then half of that will go back to the cities and towns, up to a cap usually. This year we were not able to get the Democrats to agree on that, which was rather disappointing because I think, money was tight, but certainly money was tight in the cities and towns and the school districts, and they really did need that local aid. So that's where you might see things go down party lines. I didn't see any major issues this year that I think were as divided on party lines. Even certain big bills that came forward representative-wise, you had probably an equal percentage of Republicans and Democrats voting in either direction. Maybe not exactly, but I mean, you did have bipartisanship on most of the major issues that came before the legislature.
Okay, I think a lot of people, if you read hear the talk on the street and read some of the editorials, which in our part of the world, outside of the globe, is the sun.
The little sun, right?
There's a lot of people very confused about whether we really have a democratic process,
Right.
and you just kind of explained how you work with them and so forth. But the question I want to ask is that a lot of times, it's so confusing to the average citizen about where you have people, and I'm going to say this, and I hate to generalize it, but I was for it before I was against it, kind of routine. People really can't follow the legislative process and find out where their local representative really fell on something like this. I mean, is that just us not knowing, or is that just how the process is?
I think it is all public record, actually. If people did want to know on a certain bill how their legislator voted, they can get that roll call vote. The only thing I can say about I was for it before I was against it type of thing, I know that when I first was running for state representative, somebody asked me, they said, would you ever change your position on something? And I thought about it. I said, well, I would hope I would never be that arrogant that if I learned new information and, why bother having committee hearings if you're not going to listen, really? So I said, no, I hope I would never get to that point that if something that I found out information that maybe made me change my position, then I should take that into consideration and change my position if that's the right thing to do. So over time, you may change your position, but it could be because of information that you've received. So I know that I have had different stances even on issues like the raising the cap on the charter schools. You may see it one way and then you may see it another, is essentially.
Well, given that, and you talked about the concerns, what were, you said you couldn't get everything done that you wanted to last time. What were really some of what you think the top 2 or 3 concerns that the legislature had to deal with that they successfully dealt with?
Well, I think a big thing this session, I would say if you were going to say what were the top issues of the session, one was the opioid issue. We took that on pretty strongly. Adding new programs, new beds for people with addiction issues and things like that in the state. So there have been some changes. I don't know if you're even aware, but our system was really flawed with regard to how to work with addicts in recovery. And women, for the most part, were being put in more of a prison setting during that holding period when they were what they call sectioned for addiction. We've now opened up a whole slew of new beds in places where they can actually get treatment. So treatment seems to be on the rise. Another big thing that came down at the end of the session was the environmental and energy legislation. There was an omnibus piece of legislation with regard to starting to really purposefully work towards coming up with sustainable, renewable energy sources, which has been talked about for many, many years, but I don't feel like we've ever put pen to paper and really established programs like we did this time. So those were two. On the social issues, you know, I mainly am more familiar with the issues that came through the Judiciary Committee. Some made it through and some didn't. A big concern of a lot of people in the area has been the alimony reform. We did the alimony reform bill a few years ago. It was challenged, some aspects of it, and the Supreme Judicial Court said that they didn't think we meant it the way we wrote it. So we took that to heart and we redid it and we fixed it. That passed in the House, but it didn't pass in the Senate. It didn't get done by the end of the deadline. Shared parenting was also a big concern with a lot of people. Getting rid of mandatory minimums on drug offenses was a big concern. Eliminating solitary confinement was a big concern. Those are some of the bigger ones that came up. And then the one that did actually go through the House and Senate was the transgender equality bill, which that did pass.
I'm going to bring that up
Oh,
a
okay.
bit later. But it was interesting that you brought it up, and it is a discussion point. You know, I think people probably have a fairly generalized view. If you are at my age, you went through some kind of civics class and history back in those days. But the idea about where you have Senate and House conferences when you disagree and so forth, I assume that goes on at the state and a Commonwealth government too, don't they?
Well, there's a conference committee,
Yeah.
yes. Okay, so what ends up happening is that the House will pass it, then the Senate will pass it. In the area of transgender, I think it went the other direction, though. I think Senate passed it, and then the House passed it. And anything that deals with money has to go through the House first before it goes to the Senate, but others can go the other direction. The two versions were very different, and the House version basically had gone already before the executive branch, had gone before the governor, and the Senate version, and he more or less said he would not veto the House version, but he would veto the Senate version. So I actually was appointed to that conference committee, which would have 3 House members and 3 Senate members, and then we work out the differences. We stayed pretty close to the House version, though, because as I articulated, we knew that was the one he was going to agree to, and we thought we had the better bill anyway. So.
Okay. So what do you see as you're out of session now?
Yes, we are out of session now.
And when you come back, what do you think are going to be the hot things that you have to deal with?
I don't think the alimony reform thing is going to stop, and I don't think the shared parenting is going to stop. I think you're going to see more on the opioid, and more things are going to come up with regard to that, as well as all the prison-related issues. But I think a huge thing is going to be what happened at the very end of this past session with the Attorney General relative to the gun laws. And it literally happened the last week of the second year of the session. So just so people understand, the first year of the session starts the first Wednesday after New Year's. And that session runs until July 31st, takes off for the month of August, resumes back until up near the holidays, and then it stops for the first year. Goes back in January, and then the end of that 2-year session is July 31st of the second year. So anything that doesn't make its way through and get passed during or you know, brought up and not passed or whatever, that's it as far as formal sessions. There's still some types of minor things that get passed. The House meets twice a week still for informal sessions. So things do continue to pass, but they're of a smaller nature. The good part about that is you can catch up on a lot of stuff in your district. The bad part about that is that all of those things that didn't make it through have to come back the next session. So every session, you will probably have almost the same bills as you had the last session. And again, each bill will get assigned to a committee, and each committee will have to have a hearing on that bill. So that's why it takes almost 2 years. I know with the Judiciary Committee, we didn't finish up our hearings until maybe June of the second year. And hearings are not, they can be, at least in the Judiciary Committee, they can go anywhere from an hour to 12 hours. So you have people coming in from all over the state. All of them deserve their opportunity to be heard. And so they can be rather time consuming to sift through all the testimony and all the information.
Well, since you brought up, I wanted, as we talked off camera a little bit, but there's a lot of people that really don't understand this gun situation, and it's a hot button, obviously, with some people, and if it was just the one thing that the Attorney General had done, it might be just that, but there's been a couple things that she's done that have got people upset, but in particular, this one seems to be the most obvious. Now, the governor said he had some questions about it, and 59 House representatives. You were one of the people that signed some questions.
Yeah, I actually think the entire Republican caucus signed on to it.
Okay, great. So, having done that, okay, what is the next step? What happens with that concern? Does the Attorney General says, well, fine, they're concerned, I don't care, you can't touch me, I'm going to move on, or is there a process that moderates or changes what the decision was?
Well, what I would liken it to is a few years ago, there was the gas tax, and the Republican caucus fought very hard to not have that gas tax. In fact, I don't think Brad Jones, I think he practically stood on his head and spit wooden nickels. I mean, he did everything he could to stop it, but it didn't stop it. So then there was a little bit of a break, and at that point in time, it hung in the air, and the public really got familiar with what had happened, okay? And a real big effort to overturn it came about. Now, that was a little bit easier because it was a bill that we put forward and a bill that we could overturn. Basically, in the next session, we could put a bill to overturn it. This is going to be a little bit trickier because it wasn't a piece of legislation. So what would have to happen, I believe, is starting in January, you will see a barrage of bills that'll change the way that law will be interpreted. And by doing that, maybe you overturn what the Attorney General did, because a lot of people felt that she may have usurped the authority of the legislature when she did that what she did was not simply regulation interpreting legislation, which happens all the time, but rather it transformed the present law to a new law, and that really would be within the province of the legislature, not within the province of the Attorney General.
Okay. Which leads me to the next question, and we've got an election coming up, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but there are 4 citizen petitions that I know of right now on there, and 3 of them I consider are fairly social issues that I'll call it the transgender issue, and then marijuana, and then gambling, and then of course the last one is about animal, I don't want to say animal rights, but welfare, so forth. But on the first 3, this, it takes a lot of effort to get these things, these petitions up, and Massachusetts doesn't make it easy. But my question is, if you have that many people really pushing that issue, and they feel like the state legislature is not really reflecting their views, I mean, how do you guys read that when you see that in the, we didn't vote this way, but there's a lot of people that are going to force the state to do it. I'm not saying any kind of retribution, but it's like, so what? We don't reflect the will of the people. They can do it themselves, but no one ever really moves them out of the office. So
Okay.
how do you see that?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. Actually, the transgender issue is not a ballot question this year. That it may become one. I know there's, I think, an effort afoot to make it one the next time. But the issue, the one that I think you might have missed out of the four is raising the cap on the charter schools.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So raising the cap on the charter schools, that among the others, the casino bill, the slots parlor bill, the marijuana bill, and now I'm trying to remember
The animals,
the animal cruelty, the charter schools,
gambling.
and marijuana.
Right.
Those are the four. Okay. So, for instance, I can tell you from my perspective that they're all heard. All of these have come through as bills. In fact, probably not just one bill regarding it each session, but multiple bills may be regarding it. And each bill gets assigned to a committee. The marijuana bill has been heard by the Judiciary Committee, so I'll speak to that one. And that was a very lengthy testimony type of hearing. It's actually 3 sessions that I've sat through that bill has come before us. We don't take it lightly. I'm going to tell you that we probably have heard over the last 6 years hundreds of people testify with regard to the issue, experts on both sides of the issue. So what the hearing process does is the committee then reviews the testimony, reviews the material, and then the members have to vote whether they want to send it out of committee. And the standard language is ought to pass or ought not to pass. So if you vote it ought to pass, and if a majority of the Judiciary Committee voted that ought to pass based upon all the information we received and the writing of the exact bill that was before us, then we send it to third reading and steering, and maybe it makes it, well, then finally I think Ways and Means, and then the floor. Okay, and it's really a process after committee. So there were bills that we actually sent ought to pass that didn't pass. They just didn't make it through in time, which is my argument with the 2 years, because I think if we kept going in formal session longer, we wouldn't waste people's time quite as much if the sessions were a little bit longer.
So let me just make sure I understand. In reality, the subcommittees or the committee work is really kind of a quality check,
Right.
On what's going to be presented to the House.
Right.
And sometimes these things don't get through.
Exactly. Okay. So for instance, the marijuana bill, we voted ought not to pass, I believe. I know I voted ought not to pass. I said ought not to pass on that one. Based on all of the combined testimony, experts in the medical field and law enforcement, advocates for the bill, listening to all sides, it was not compelling that the bill before us should have been passed or would have passed when it hit the floor, okay? Other bills, for instance, shared parenting, okay? We voted ought to pass, and shared parenting made its way all the way through all of those levels. It did get to the House floor. It was approved on the House side, but then it fell short because it wasn't approved on the Senate side. I've been on, I was on a conference committee a few years ago on raising the statute of limitations on sex abuse cases. And that one didn't become law because it didn't make it through the conference committee by the end of the year, that we couldn't come to an agreement. And so it started all over again, and I believe it passed very shortly into the next session. But that's the thing. It's not that these issues haven't been vetted. They have been vetted. And the fact that they're not law could be one of those reasons that I just gave you. Either we didn't, based on everything, think it's something that would pass on the floor, whether it made it through the process of the House but not the Senate, or whether it got to conference committee and it got stalled there. But pretty much, I can tell you the education issue has come up, I believe, during the budget season as well. The extra slots is basically a budget issue as well, so it would be brought up during the context of each year's budget. And then the animal cruelty, again, that was one that has gone through the Judiciary Committee, and I can tell you that that was an ought to pass on the part of most of the members that I strongly support that bill myself. But you have people on the other side that don't. So, you're always faced with that.
Well, I guess it's interesting. I'm fascinated by the way you explain it. Let me just ask, when you have these petitions, and let's say they pass, how does that influence how to put this? Who executes that? I mean, the legislature says, okay, this got passed by the people.
Right.
We never voted on, but it's become law. What do you do with that at that point?
Right.
I mean, do you just say, okay,
Well,
that's a judicial thing, or is that the governor?
No, that's a good question. So the example I would give you on that was the last ballot question that came before us that was sort of a contested issue was the medical marijuana one. And after that passed, we returned to session, and amongst numerous bills, and I mean numerous, was pretty much every state, every city and town in the state sending in something in that they not be allowed to have a medical marijuana facility in their town, that they wanted to have one of those. They had a home rule petition, basically. So we were then faced with the issue of, okay, it's passed as a petition, so it needs to be part of our laws, but how do we orchestrate it so we still hear the will of the people as far as how it gets implemented? Mm-hmm. And that took quite some time. So mm-hmm. you didn't see a lot of medical marijuana facilities right outside the gate. Mm-hmm. It's really taken to almost the 2-year term where you're really starting to now see it take some hold. I think they just opened the first one in Boston a couple weeks ago. So,
well, we here in Westford are dealing with it, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that was and certain things like the medical marijuana, to some extent, we conferred with people in California regarding that, officials in California, and I know on the marijuana bill we sent a delegation, and I would have to say this delegation included from the most liberal of the House and Senate to the most conservative of the House and Senate, and everything in between. Every single one of them came back saying, don't pass it, based on the information they received from the state of Colorado. So there's a lot more to it than people think with that marijuana bill. There's some of the concerns that have been raised are rather significant. And I understand, I understand both sides of that issue, and I've certainly listened to people on both sides of that issue. But it was interesting to us that when we sent out what we considered to be a delegation that was completely diverse, partisan, bipartisan and whatnot, conservative, liberal, everything, absolutely, they all said, don't do it. So
well, it's good to know that.
Yeah.
And, we're in closing. I really need to know, you're running again?
I am running again, yes.
Is there anything anybody wants to help, how they get in touch with you?
Oh, sure. Actually, if you would like to help, I do have a website, but the fastest way to probably do it is to call my Groton Law office, and we are taking a list there. I have my volunteers use part of the space during the election period, and we'll get back to you, and we'll set it up so that you can be involved.
Great. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who see this who will want to help.
Well, I hope so.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody, and just remember, if you're ever confused, always get a second opinion.